Her ribs were shattered, and every breath felt like drowning in broken glass. Through blurred vision and trembling fingers, she typed a desperate message to her brother, a final plea before the bathroom door gave way. She hit send, unaware that one mistyped digit had redirected her cry for help to a stranger's phone. Moments later, a reply appeared from an unknown number. 4 words that would change both their lives: "I'm on my way." The bathroom door was the only barrier between Elizabeth Garrett and the man she had once promised to love, honor, and obey. The wood around the lock splintered with each impact, betraying how close Richard was to breaking through. Every thud of his fist sent shockwaves of agony radiating through Elizabeth's fractured ribs. She was curled on the cold marble floor, arms wrapped protectively around her torso. Each breath was a serrated knife scraping against her lungs. He had struck her, once, twice, a third time with his knee, before she'd managed to stumble into the bathroom and turn the lock with shaking hands. "Open this door, Elizabeth." Richard's voice carried that dangerous calm he used in courtrooms, the one that made judges lean forward and juries hang on his every word. But underneath it, she heard the rage, barely leashed. "Don't make me embarrass you further. You know how this ends." Elizabeth squeezed her eyes shut. Tears carved hot trails down her cheeks, mixing with the blood from her split lip. She fumbled for her phone, her lifeline, her last hope. She needed her brother. She needed someone who remembered the woman she'd been before Richard Garrett made her his wife and his prisoner. Her vision swam. The pain in her side was blinding, making the screen blur into an incomprehensible glow. She tried to pull up her brother's contact, but her thumbs kept slipping on the glass, betraying her with their violent trembling. Finally, she managed to open a message thread. She didn't check which one. She couldn't. "Help me. He broke my ribs. Please, Thomas. I think I'm dying." The wood cracked again, louder this time. The lock wouldn't hold much longer. Elizabeth pressed send. She dropped the phone, clutching her side as a coughing fit seized her lungs, bringing up the copper taste of blood. She waited for the phone to buzz, for Thomas to call and say he was bringing the police, that help was coming, that she just needed to hold on. 30 seconds passed. The phone buzzed. Elizabeth grabbed it with desperate hope, but the message wasn't from Thomas. It was from a number she didn't recognize. No contact name. No profile picture. Just digits she'd never seen before. The message read, "Who is this? Are you in danger?" Elizabeth's heart plummeted. She had typed the wrong number. One wrong digit, and her final lifeline had snapped. Despair settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She was going to die here, on this bathroom floor, because her broken body had failed her at the moment she needed it most. "I'm going to count to 3, Elizabeth," Richard called through the door. 1. With nothing left to lose, perhaps delirious from pain, perhaps surrendering to fate, Elizabeth typed back to the stranger. "I sent this to the wrong number. I'm sorry. My husband is going to kill me tonight. I just wanted my brother to know where to find me." She let the phone slip from her fingers. It was over. 7 miles away, in the penthouse office of Arrey International, the atmosphere was glacial and controlled. Michael Arrey sat at the head of a conference table made of imported Italian marble, surrounded by 12 executives who collectively managed $18 billion in assets. The city sprawled beneath them through floor-to-ceiling windows, a kingdom of glass and steel that Michael had built from nothing. He was listening to a presentation about a hostile takeover when his personal phone vibrated against the table. Not his business line. His personal phone, a device whose number was known to exactly 7 people in the world. He frowned, glancing at the screen. An unknown number. Michael's first instinct was to ignore it. Spam. A data breach. Someone fishing for ransom or leverage. But something made him open it. "Help me. He broke my ribs. Please, Thomas. I think I'm dying." Michael went still. The presentation continued around him, but the words became white noise. He read the message again, his jaw tightening. A second message appeared. "I sent this to the wrong number. I'm sorry. My husband is going to kill me tonight. I just wanted my brother to know where to find me." The conference room fell away. Michael was no longer sitting in his tower of glass and power. He was 12 years old again, standing outside his mother's bedroom door, listening to her muffled sobs after his stepfather left for work. He remembered the lies she told about falling downstairs. The long-sleeved shirts in summer. The way she flinched when doors slammed. He remembered finding her, years later, when the lies had finally stopped. This message could be a competitor's trap. A con. A setup by one of the dozen people who wanted to see him fall. But Michael Arrey hadn't built an empire by playing it safe. He'd built it by trusting his instincts. And his instincts were screaming that this was real. He looked up. His head of security, Davis, stood against the wall like a sentinel. Trace this number, Michael said quietly, sliding his phone across the table. I want a GPS location in 30 seconds. And I want the registered owner of the property. Davis didn't ask questions. He never did. He pulled out a tablet, fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Tracking, Davis murmured. Got it. Residential address in Thornhill Heights. 847 Ashford Lane. Registered to Richard Garrett. Michael's blood turned to ice. He knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. Richard Garrett. Deputy City Attorney. The man who'd sent 3 of Michael's business rivals to prison on what everyone knew were trumped-up corruption charges. The man who smiled for cameras and eviscerated witnesses on the stand. The man whose political star was rising so fast that people whispered about a mayoral run. And apparently, behind closed doors, a man who broke his wife's ribs. Michael stood up. The room fell silent. Every executive at the table turned to look at him. This meeting is over, Michael said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Clear my schedule for the night. He turned to Davis. Get the car. Bring Reeves and Torres. Full tactical gear. Davis's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. Are we expecting resistance? Michael buttoned his suit jacket, his face carved from stone. We're going to get her out. Whatever it takes. Back in the bathroom, Elizabeth had given up. She lay on the floor, each breath more painful than the last, waiting for the door to break and for everything to end. Her phone buzzed one more time. She almost didn't look. But something, instinct, hope, or simple human curiosity, made her lift the screen to her face. The message was from the stranger. 3 words that didn't make sense. I'm on my way. Elizabeth stared at the screen, convinced she was hallucinating. Who was this person? How could they be on their way? They didn't even know where she was. Before she could process it, another message appeared. 847 Ashford Lane. Hold on. Do not open that door. Help is coming. Elizabeth's breath caught. They knew her address. This stranger, whoever they were, had traced her location and was actually coming. For the first time in 3 years, Elizabeth felt something she'd forgotten how to feel. Hope. Outside the door, Richard's countdown reached 0. The heavy thud of a shoulder hitting wood echoed through the hallway, followed by the jagged splintering of the doorframe. Elena didn't wait to see the wood give way. She scrambled backward, her socks sliding on the polished hardwood, until she reached the relative sanctuary of the guest bathroom. She threw the bolt just as a heavy weight slammed into the other side, making the small room shudder. Adrenaline surged through her, a cold, metallic taste coating the back of her tongue. She backed into the corner, pressing herself against the cold porcelain of the tub, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that she desperately tried to silence. Outside, the muffled curses of the men grew louder, punctuated by the rhythmic, violent kicking against the door. It wouldn't hold. The hinges were already groaning under the pressure. With trembling fingers, Elena pulled her phone from her pocket, the screen's harsh glow illuminating her pale, tear-streaked face. Her vision blurred as she tapped the messaging app. She didn't have time to call. They would hear her voice. She needed to send a signal, a digital flare for help. Her thumbs hovered over the glass, slick with sweat. She typed a frantic, disjointed plea for help, including the address and a desperate instruction to call the police. She didn't check the name at the top of the thread. She couldn't afford the second it would take to verify. With a sharp gasp as the bathroom door's upper panel finally cracked, she hit send. The little, delivered, chime felt like a death knell. Only then did her eyes drift upward to the contact name. It wasn't her brother. It wasn't the police. It was a string of digits she didn't recognize, an unsaved number from a missed call weeks ago that she had meant to delete. The realization hit her harder than the physical assault outside. The lifeline she had just thrown out into the dark was headed toward a total stranger, someone who had no idea who she was or that she was currently staring at a door that was seconds away from bursting open. The floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse acted as a silent barrier between Michael Arrey and the chaotic hum of the city 60 stories below. Here, the air was filtered, the lighting was recessed, and the silence was absolute. Michael sat at his minimalist desk, the amber liquid in his glass catching the moonlight as he reviewed a series of acquisition contracts. His life was a masterpiece of controlled variables. He had spent years pruning away the messy, the unpredictable, and the emotional until only the steel skeleton of his empire remained. He preferred it this way. People were liabilities, and connections were merely avenues for disappointment. A sharp, intrusive vibration cut through the stillness. Michael didn't move at first. His personal phone sat on the corner of the mahogany surface, its screen pulsing with a persistent light. He rarely received messages after hours, and never from numbers not already embedded in his encrypted contact list. He ignored it, returning his gaze to the legal jargon on his monitor, but the silence of the room seemed thinner now, haunted by that brief electronic intrusion. Curiosity, a trait he usually kept under a tight leash, eventually won out. He reached for the device, his thumbprint unlocking the interface with a soft click. The message was a jagged tear in his sterile reality. It wasn't a business proposal or a social invitation, it was a frantic, misspelled scream for mercy. He read the address, a neighborhood miles away from his high-rise sanctuary, and the words "Please, they're breaking in." Michael stared at the screen, his face a mask of frozen indifference, yet his pulse quickened against his will. This was a glitch in his system, a stray signal from a world he had successfully tuned out. He should delete it. He should assume it was a prank or a mistake and return to his contracts. But as he looked out at the sprawling grid of the city, the coldness of his high tower felt suddenly, uncomfortably hollow. Somewhere out there, a woman was counting on a person she didn't know to be her savior, and by some cruel twist of digital fate, that phantom was him. The roar of black SUVs cutting through the quiet suburban street was the only warning the attackers received. Michael's security detail moved with the surgical precision of a shadow, a stark contrast to the blunt, panicked violence of the men currently tearing through the house. Michael watched from the back of the lead vehicle, his expression unreadable, his heart a steady, cold rhythm. He didn't belong here, yet as his lead tactical officer signaled the breach, he found himself stepping out into the humid night air. Inside, the symphony of chaos reached its crescendo. The husband's hired guards, caught off guard by the sheer professionalism of the incoming force, scrambled to reposition. The hallway became a blurred theater of muffled thuds and suppressed gunfire. Michael's team operated like a single organism, neutralizing the perimeter and sweeping toward the back of the house where the sensors indicated the most movement. They weren't there to negotiate, they were there to extract a high-value asset they didn't even know. When the bathroom door finally groaned on its last hinge, it wasn't a captor's hand that reached through the debris, but the gloved hand of Michael's lead operative. Secure, the voice crackled over the comms. Michael walked through the wreckage of the foyer, stepping over the groaning forms of the husband's men, and stopped at the threshold of the guest bathroom. The woman huddled in the tub looked less like a person and more like a collection of tremors. Her hair was matted, her eyes wide and glassy with a shock so profound she didn't even scream when he approached. He looked down at her, this Elizabeth, the source of the digital cry that had pierced his isolation. She looked up, and for a moment, the high tower indifference Michael had cultivated for a decade shattered. There was no gratitude in her eyes yet, only a raw, primal question. He reached out a hand, not with warmth, but with a terrifyingly solid presence. "You sent a message," Michael said, his voice a low, melodic friction in the small room. "I'm the one who answered. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 4, where Michael takes Elizabeth to a safe house, or should we explore the husband's reaction to the failed assault?" The first thing Elizabeth noticed was the smell, sandalwood, expensive linen, and the sterile, ozone scent of high-altitude air. It was a far cry from the copper tang of blood and the damp chill of the bathroom floor. She shifted beneath a duvet that felt heavier and softer than anything she had ever touched, her muscles aching with a dull, throbbing reminder of the night's brutality. As her eyes fluttered open, she was met not with the peeling wallpaper of her own home, but with a cavernous ceiling and a wall of glass that revealed a city draped in early morning mist. She sat up slowly, clutching the silk sheets to her chest. Michael Arrey was there, silhouetted against the dawn, a silhouette of sharp angles and absolute stillness. He didn't turn immediately, allowing her the moment to realize she was safe, or at least, no longer hunted. "You're in the North Tower," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through velvet. "My private residence. You were sedated by my medic for shock." Elizabeth found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "Why? You don't even know me." Michael turned then, crossing the room with a predatory grace that made her heart skip. He didn't offer a smile, he offered a tablet. On the screen was not just the message she had sent, but a background file his team had compiled in the intervening hours. As they spoke, the coincidences began to unravel into something far more sinister. Michael's recent acquisition of a logistics firm wasn't just a business move, it was the very company Elizabeth's husband had been using to funnel untraceable assets. The wrong recipient hadn't been a glitch at all. The number she had reached out to was one Michael had used briefly during the merger negotiations, a line linked to the very man her husband was trying to defraud. They weren't strangers brought together by fate, they were two ends of a bridge that her husband was currently trying to burn down. The realization settled between them, heavy and cold. Elizabeth wasn't just a victim he had rescued, she was the key to the empire he was building, and he was the only man powerful enough to keep her alive. The silence of the penthouse was shattered by the flickering blue light of the media wall. Michael stood with his arms crossed, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line as the broadcast flickered to life. On the screen, Elizabeth's husband, Julian, sat in a meticulously staged studio setting. He looked the part of the grieving, bewildered spouse, his tie loosened just enough to suggest exhaustion, his eyes reddened with practiced grief. He spoke with a voice that trembled at exactly the right moments, painting a terrifyingly convincing portrait of a man desperate to save his wife from herself. He spoke of Elizabeth's fragile mental state, citing fabricated medical histories and recent, erratic outbursts that had forced him to seek professional intervention for her own safety. But the narrative didn't stop at her supposed instability. With a calculated pivot, Julian turned his gaze toward the camera, accusing Michael Arrey of using his vast wealth and influence to abduct a vulnerable woman. He called Michael a predator, a corporate titan who had mistaken a human life for another asset to be seized by force. Elizabeth watched from the edge of the sofa, her knuckles white as she gripped the fabric. To the world, she was no longer a victim of domestic terror, she was a woman lost in a psychological break, held captive by a billionaire with dark intentions. The news anchors began to dissect the scandal, pulling up old photographs of Michael's cold, unsmiling face at gala events, using them as evidence of his detached and dangerous nature. The strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. By attacking her sanity, Julian had effectively stripped away her voice before she could even speak. Any truth she told now would be dismissed as the rambling of a broken mind. Michael finally turned off the screen, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the accusations. He looked at Elizabeth, seeing the flicker of despair in her eyes. Julian hadn't just come for her life, he was coming for her reality. The walls of the sanctuary felt thinner now, no longer just a shield against violence, but a cage built out of public opinion. The digital world was now a minefield, but Elizabeth couldn't remain a ghost. While Michael was entrenched in a war room with his legal counsel, she retreated to the far end of the terrace, her breath hitching as she dialed the one number she had memorized since childhood. Her brother, Leo, was her North Star, the only person who knew the truth of her life before Julian's shadow had eclipsed it. When the line clicked open, the relief that washed over her was so visceral she nearly collapsed. Leo, thank God, she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm safe, but you've seen the news. You have to tell them it's all a lie. You have the records of the hospital visit from last year, the ones Julian made me hide. There was a long, hollow silence on the other end. When Leo finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual warmth, it was flat, rehearsed, and curdled with a strange sort of pity. Liz, you need to come home. Julian is worried sick. He told me about the episodes. He told me you've been confused for a long time. The air in Elizabeth's lungs turned to ice. What are you talking about? Leo, he hit me. He tried to kill me. You were the one who told me to leave him. I think you're remembering things wrong, Leo replied, and she could almost hear the rustle of expensive fabric in the background, a sound he couldn't afford on a teacher's salary. Julian has been very generous. He's set up a trust for mom's care, and he's willing to get you the best psychiatric help available. Just tell me where you are. I'll come get you myself. We can end this nightmare. The realization settled in her gut like lead. The trust fund, the sudden shift in narrative, the scripted empathy, Julian hadn't just smeared her, he had dismantled her support system from the inside out. Her own flesh and blood had been appraised and purchased. She stared at the phone as the betrayal burned through her veins, realizing that the man in the high tower was the only person left who didn't have a price tag. Without a word, she ended the call and let the device slip from her fingers, watching it shatter on the marble floor. She was truly alone now, a woman with no past and a hunted future, standing in the cold light of a sanctuary that was fast becoming a fortress. The silence that followed the destruction of Elizabeth's phone was heavy, a suffocating weight that Michael eventually broke with the soft click of his glass hitting a coaster. He had watched her from the shadows of the doorway, seeing the exact moment the light of hope died in her eyes. He knew that look, he had seen it mirrored in a bathroom mirror decades ago, etched into the face of a woman he had been too small to protect. He bought him, she whispered, her voice hollow, eyes fixed on the shards of glass on the floor. My own brother. How does a person compete with that much gravity? Julian's money, it just bends everyone toward him. Michael walked toward the window, his back to her, looking out at the city that fueled his power. Money doesn't just bend people, Elizabeth. It breaks them. It creates a vacuum where the truth used to be. He paused, his reflection in the glass looking older, more tired than he ever allowed the world to see. You asked why I came for a stranger. Why did I risk a public scandal for a text message? He turned to face her, his expression stripped of its usual corporate armor. My mother spent her life in a house very similar to yours. She was married to a man who understood that if you control the narrative, you control the person. He was a pillar of the community, a philanthropist, a saint in the eyes of the public. Behind closed doors, he was a monster who systematically erased her. Michael's voice remained steady, but there was a vibrating intensity behind his words. She sent letters. She made calls. She begged for someone to see through the polish. But her family was bought, just like yours. Her friends were charmed. When she finally tried to run, there was no one waiting on the other side. By the time I was old enough to understand the game, she was gone, driven to a mental break that ended in a quiet, lonely tragedy. He stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers with a fierce, shared understanding. I didn't answer that text because I'm a hero. I answered it because I spent 20 years becoming the man who could finally send the help she never got. You aren't just an asset, Elizabeth. You are the second chance I never thought I'd have. The strategy was born not of desperation, but of cold, calculated irony. If Julian wanted to use the public eye as a weapon, Michael would give him a stage so bright he would blind himself. The annual Solstice Gala, a masquerade of the city's elite, was only 48 hours away. It was Julian's home turf, the place where he felt most invincible, surrounded by the very people he had bought and the narratives he had spun. He thinks you are a ghost, Michael said, standing over a digital map of the gala's venue. He thinks he has successfully buried you in a psychiatric ward of public opinion. He won't be looking for a victim, he'll be looking for praise. That is when we strike. The plan required Elizabeth to do the unthinkable, return to the lion's den. She wouldn't arrive as the broken woman the news cycles had depicted, but as a phantom under Michael's protection. Michael's security team began the grueling process of preparation, mapping the ballroom's blind spots and tapping into the venue's internal servers. They needed more than just her presence, they needed a confession, a crack in the pristine marble of Julian's reputation. Michael watched Elizabeth as she practiced the posture of a woman who wasn't afraid. She wore a dress of midnight silk that matched the shadows they were preparing to inhabit. Julian's guards know your face, Michael warned, his voice low. But they don't know my reach. We've compromised two of the event's waitstaff and the lead technician for the AV suite. When the clock strikes midnight, the feed won't be showing his promotional videos. It will be showing the truth. Elizabeth looked at her reflection, seeing a stranger, a woman forged in the fires of the last few days. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was being slowly replaced by a dark, shimmering purpose. She wasn't just running anymore. With Michael's resources and his shared vendetta against men who hid behind masks, she was becoming the very thing Julian feared most, a witness who refused to stay silent. They were stepping out of the high tower and into the fray, moving toward a confrontation where the only exit strategy was total victory. The ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and false smiles, a curated sanctuary for the powerful. Julian stood at the center of it all, the light of a dozen chandeliers reflecting in his eyes as he held court. He was mid-sentence, regaling a senator with a story of his own resilience, when the air in the room seemed to thin. The massive digital screens that had been looping footage of his charitable foundations flickered, then died. A heavy, rhythmic pulse began to thrum through the speakers, silencing the orchestra. Then, the screen surged back to life. It wasn't the polished campaign film the audience expected. It was a jagged, high-definition recording from the night of the assault, the raw, unedited feed from the hallway cameras Julian thought his men had wiped. The room watched in a paralyzed hush as the image of the grieved husband appeared, his face contorted with a terrifying, calculated rage as he ordered his guards to break the door and finish it. The gasps of the elite rose like a tide. Julian's face drained of color, his practiced mask dissolving into a panicked sweat. He spun toward the AV booth, shouting for a kill switch that no longer responded to his commands. The truth has a way of finding the light, Julian. Even in a room full of shadows. The voice was low, resonant, and came from the top of the grand staircase. Michael Arrey stood there, a dark sentinel of justice, but it was the woman beside him who stopped the room's collective heart. Elizabeth stepped forward, her midnight silk dress flowing behind her like a funeral shroud for Julian's reputation. She didn't look like a woman in the throes of a breakdown, she looked like a judge. Julian lunged toward the stairs, his composure shattered, his voice a frantic snarl. She's sick. This is a fabrication, a billionaire's parlor trick. But the screen changed again, displaying a series of offshore ledger transfers, the paper trail Michael's team had finally cracked, linking the assault directly to Julian's personal accounts. As the first pair of handcuffs clicked into place on Julian's wrists in front of the flashing bulbs of the press, Elizabeth looked down at the man who had tried to erase her. For the first time, she didn't see a monster, she saw a small, hollow man drowning in the vacuum he had created. She turned to Michael, and in the wreckage of a tyrant's life, they found a silent, unbreakable understanding. The message had finally been received. The morning air on the terrace was crisp, carrying the faint, briny scent of the harbor far below. Elizabeth stood at the glass railing, her hands resting lightly on the cold metal. For months, every inhale had been a calculated risk, a shallow expansion of lungs against the sharp, stabbing reminder of fractured bone and purpled skin. But today, as the sun began to bleed gold over the skyline, she drew a breath, a deep, grounding draft that filled her chest until it felt light. The phantom pain of Julian's violence had finally receded, leaving behind a body that no longer felt like a crime scene. The legal fallout had been a whirlwind of depositions and headlines, a systematic dismantling of the empire Julian had built on lies. He was behind bars, his influence cauterized, his voice silenced by the very truth he had tried to bury. Her brother had reached out, his messages filled with desperate, groveling apologies, but Elizabeth had deleted them without a second thought. Some things, she realized, could not be bought back once they were sold. A soft footfall sounded on the stone behind her. She didn't flinch. She didn't tighten her shoulders in anticipation of a blow. Michael joined her at the railing, his usual suit jacket discarded, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up. They stood in a comfortable silence, two people who had found a strange, quiet anchor in the wake of a storm. The wind is changing, Michael remarked, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He wasn't looking at the city as a collection of assets anymore, but as a place where the air was finally clear. Elizabeth looked at him, seeing the man who had answered a stranger's cry and, in doing so, had quieted the ghosts of his own past. She realized then that the golden sanctuary was no longer the penthouse or the security detail. It was the simple, profound ability to exist in a space without looking for an exit. She closed her eyes and took another breath, full, deep, and entirely her own. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't a precursor to a scream. It was just peace.